The year is 1492. But instead of Christopher Columbus sailing west across the Atlantic, the world holds its breath as the last Christian kingdom of Europe falls. A crescent moon rises above Paris. The call to prayer echoes from the spires of what was once Notre Dame. Latin fades into obscurity, replaced by Arabic as the language of scholarship, law, and empire. Europe, the cradle of what we know as the modern Western world, is no longer Christian. It is Islamic, absorbed into the vast caliphate that stretched from the sands of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. But how did this happen? And what kind of world would we live in today if the Islamic Caliphate had truly conquered Europe? That's what we're going to uncover in this alternate history. And if you stay with me until the very end, you'll see how this scenario would reshape not just Europe, but the entire modern world. So, where does history change? Our divergence point begins in the 8th century. In real history, the Islamic armies surged into Europe after conquering North Africa and most of the Iberian Peninsula. They advanced into modern-day France, but in 732, at the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, halted the Muslim advance. This was a decisive turning point that prevented Europe from falling under Islamic rule. But what if things had gone differently? Imagine if the Umayyad Caliphate had crushed Charles Martel's forces. The road to Paris would have been wide open. Frankish kingdoms, fragmented and weak, could have collapsed one by one. By the 9th century, the Caliphate's banners might have flown not just in Spain, but in the heart of France and beyond. And here's the key cause and effect. Once the Franks fall, the papacy loses its strongest protector. Without a Christian Frankish empire, the Catholic Church would be politically powerless, Rome vulnerable, and Christianity itself at risk of becoming a minority religion in Europe. So, what happens next when the Christian heart of Europe crumbles? Europe transforms almost overnight. The old feudal system collapses. Instead, governors appointed by the Caliphate take control, ruling provinces from Cordoba, Paris, and Rome itself. The papacy, stripped of allies, might be forced to flee north, perhaps to Ireland or Scandinavia, clinging desperately to survival. But let's picture daily life. Towns across Gaul, Italy, and Germany echo with Arabic alongside local dialects. Christian churches are converted into mosques, yet dhimmi laws allow Christians and Jews to continue practicing their faith, though under heavy taxation and restrictions. Over time, conversion accelerates, whether by genuine belief, economic pressure, or the promise of political advancement. This isn't just about religion, it's about culture. Architectural skylines across Europe begin to change. Instead of Gothic cathedrals rising in the Middle Ages, imagine domes and minarets dominating London, Paris, and Rome. The payoff here is striking. Within 2 centuries, much of Europe would have looked and sounded more like Damascus or Baghdad than what we know today. But if Europe becomes Islamic, what happens to the rest of Christendom? The Byzantine Empire, long the buffer between Islam and Europe, now finds itself surrounded. With Western Europe absorbed, Byzantium might fall centuries earlier than it did in our timeline. Constantinople, instead of holding out until 1453, could collapse by the 10th century, bringing Orthodox Christianity under the Caliphate's shadow as well. And what about the papacy? Without strong kingdoms to defend it, Christianity becomes a marginal faith, confined to isolated pockets in Northern Europe. Imagine the Vatican not as a thriving spiritual center, but as a historical footnote, a relic of a lost religion. Trade routes, too, take on new meaning. The Mediterranean, already dominated by Muslim fleets, becomes an Islamic lake. The Silk Road flows seamlessly from China through Baghdad to Paris. Europe, once fractured, becomes a unified economic zone under Islamic administration. This leads to a critical loop. With Europe fully absorbed, what happens to the intellectual flowering that gave rise to the Renaissance? Here's where things get fascinating. In our real history, Europe's Renaissance was fueled by rediscovering classical texts, many of which had been preserved by Muslim scholars. In this alternate timeline, that process accelerates. Instead of waiting for translations through Italy, Europe itself is directly integrated into the intellectual network of the Caliphate. Imagine Paris as a sister city to Baghdad, filled with libraries, observatories, and madrasas. Scholars debate in Arabic. Algebra, astronomy, and medicine spread rapidly across the continent centuries earlier than in our timeline. But what about art and culture? Instead of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, perhaps we'd marvel today at vast geometric mosaics in Rome. Instead of Shakespeare's plays, we might study poetic works blending Arabic and European traditions. The payoff: a Europe not just Islamic, but intellectually supercharged by being at the very heart of the Caliphate. But that leads to a bigger question. With Europe transformed, how does this affect the great voyages of discovery? In real history, Spain and Portugal spearheaded exploration of the New World. But in this alternate world, Spain and Portugal are firmly Islamic. Instead of Christian monarchs funding Columbus, it is the Caliph's court in Cordoba that sponsors ships to the west. Picture it. The first flag planted in the Americas is not a Spanish cross, but the crescent banner of the Caliphate. This changes everything. Colonization of the Americas would unfold under Islamic rather than Christian influence. Cities like Mexico City or Lima could bear Arabic names. Indigenous cultures encounter Islamic traders, administrators, and scholars rather than Catholic priests. And with Islamic Europe controlling the Atlantic, the Islamic Caliphate becomes the first true global superpower. By the 16th century, it stretches across Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. But what kind of modern world does that set up for us today? Let's leap forward to the 21st century. If Europe had been Islamic for centuries, democracy as we know it may never have taken root. Instead, we might live under variations of caliphal governance, some centralized, others fractured into emirates or sultanates. Languages would be different too. Arabic, not English, could be the global lingua franca. Universities across the world might teach an Arabic script. The Quran, not the Bible, would be the most printed book in history. And geopolitics? Instead of Western dominance, the Islamic Caliphate, stretching across continents, would set the rules. Rivalries might emerge, but they would be between different factions of the Caliphate, not between East and West. The payoff: our modern world would be unrecognizable, shaped by Islamic law, culture, and science, instead of Western liberalism. But history is never simple. Let's close with a final reflection. History often turns on fragile moments, a single battle, a single decision, a single empire rising or falling. If Charles Martel had lost at Tours, if Europe had collapsed into the Caliphate's embrace, the entire course of world history might have shifted. Would that world have been better? More unified? More advanced? More just? Or would it have stifled the diversity of thought and political experimentation that shaped our modern age? That's the haunting question of alternate history. We'll never know for certain. But imagining these roads not taken helps us understand just how delicate our own path really was. So, what do you think? Would an Islamic Europe have led to a golden age or a darker, more controlled world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the what if, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell, because we've got even more alternate history twists coming your way.